Okay, good. How's the volume? Is that all good? I'm not going to touch anything. Okay. Well, hopefully you all can hear me. Welcome to the third McArthur lecture and the next in the series on foraging to the first states by Professor Bob Allen of NYU Abu Dhabi and Oxford. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Augusta McMahon, Professor of Mesopotamian Archaeology in the Archaeology Department here, and I research early urbanism in the Middle East and the challenges and compensations of past city living. So today's lecture focuses on the impact of the Neolithic, a hugely revolutionary period involving changes in our diet, our living habits, our ways of working, all of which have had direct or indirect influences on our modern ways of life and the international economy. The Neolithic is also identified as one of several possible beginnings for the Anthropocene era, which is a time period marked by distinct and widespread visible human impact on the environment. So the Neolithic can effectively be connected to modern climate change. Domestication, farming, and herding started us on the path to deforestation. Sedentism changed our household sizes and our relationship to space, leading to land ownership, crowding, and ultimately to urban sprawl. Sedentism also changed our relationship to objects, transforming them to from things into possessions. There really are no Paleolithic hoarders, but there are Neolithic hoarders. And Neolithic inventions such as pottery have led slowly but surely to our overflowing landfills, our plastic-filled seas, and piles of discarded fast fashion in the Atacama Desert. New ways of working and new products also led to differential valorization of diverse types of labor and thus to inequality and inequity. And for decades, archaeologists have been thinking through all these past developments, picking apart traditional ideas of positive evolution and embracing humans' contradictory desires for predictability as well as productivity, and our sometimes regrettable capacity for making economically illogical choices if these choices have ideological, religious, or social value. So we're all looking forward to more of Professor Allen's perspectives from his deep study of the Industrial Revolution to the developments and challenges of the Neolithic Revolution. So please join me in welcoming Professor Allen back to the stage.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Augusta. And welcome everybody to day 3. The title is Domar and Habbakuk on the Euphrates. Domar and Habbakuk are, I should have photos of them here, but you'll see photos later, are famous economic historians. And they're going to, along with Malthus, who was our guide in the last lecture, they'll be guides in leading us through what happens over the next few millennia. So this is the time frame. We're starting in with our story. We got to about 6000 BC in the last lecture. This was the end of the PPNB, the pre-pottery Neolithic, and agriculture, with domesticated crops and animals was firmly established as a system. But it was only practiced in part of the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, where it had begun. And after 6000 BCE, it breaks out of that region and is adopted over a much broader territory, and in particular in Iraq and Mesopotamia, which is, of course, very famous for the urban developments that take place there, and a very lush and prosperous agricultural area, but one that was not under cultivation heretofore in our story. So why did this happen? So the first step is what I call the settling of the Jazira. The Jazira is the Arabic word for the northern Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the northern part, north of more or less present-day Baghdad, is the Jazira. And the second, and that's what gets settled first in a big way. And the second step is southern Mesopotamia, which we're not going to talk about much today, but it'll be the subject of the next lecture. And so I see this as an understanding why this didn't happen for a long time, this settlement, and then why it did. as a kind of as an important historical problem that I want to focus on. So there's two obvious sets of questions. One is why did it happen? And in order to analyze that, well, there's two aspects. One, there's going to be developments in farm technology that are important in explaining why it happened. And secondly, in order to understand this and work out the implications of the farm technology, we need new measures of agricultural change and productivity. In the first two lectures, we talked about return rates, how many calories you get per hour of work, and that's a useful indicator, but it's not enough to understand what's happening at this stage in the story. And then the second question is going to be, what are its implications? And there are going to be all sorts of implications for health, economic structure, new industries, towns, technical change, inequality, war, all sorts of things happen in this period, which I see as knock-on effects of the changes in agrarian technology and their implications and the settlement process that they lead to in northern Mesopotamia. So I'll try to spell all that out. So just on this geographical point of expansion, so this is a map that we had before, which shows archaeological sites before 6000 BC. And they all are tracing out, by and large, this Fertile Crescent, right? There's the Eastern Mediterranean here and up through Syria and southern Turkey, and then down the Zagros Mountains in Iraq. That's the Fertile Crescent. And you notice here that here's Mesopotamia. This is where urban civilization is going to start. Well, it's going to flourish, and it's all empty. There's not much happening there. It's not to say there's absolutely no people there, but it's not a big agricultural center. So all this changes after 6000. These are a bunch of new sites that are from that period. There is supposed to be a key here, color key, which I left off, I'm afraid, but they're color keyed as to various archaeological periods or cultures. And as the map key suggests, if you can see it, archaeologists distinguish several cultures according to Pottery Designs. In the Jazira, that's to say the northern Mesopotamia, there's the Hassuna culture along the Tigris. And this is, they're practicing there what we call rain-fed agriculture. So they're sowing seeds on land, and the rain happens, and that's the source of water, and that's where stuff grows. So it's not irrigated agriculture. The Halef culture in the northwestern part of the region and later spreading east, one of the things about these cultures is that they don't stay in the same place. It's also rain-fed agriculture. To have rain-fed agriculture, you need at least 200 millimeters of rain a year. And the northern part of this northern Mesopotamia area has that much rain. So further south, still in northern Mesopotamia, is the Samara culture, where the rain is slight and irrigation is necessary. And this is large-scale irrigation is first practiced in this region. And then looking ahead further south, if you go south of present-day Baghdad and Sumer, there's the Ubaid culture, which also spreads north, and the Uruk culture centered around Uruk, which spreads over Sumer and also spreads north or appears north. And here are some pictures of pots, plates, and so forth that illustrate this. I'm not gonna talk too much about that because it's not my area, really. But we will have something to say about some of them, and as they relate to possible reasons for the spreads of these designs. Some of these I really like, and I hope you do too. I wouldn't mind having them. So why was the Jazira settled? It was once thought that the cultures like the Halaf and so forth were the cultures of particular ethno-linguistic groups that moved into the Jazira. This view is now generally rejected. But that's not to say there weren't population movements into the Jazira. There were. In fact, if there was not being virtually anybody there at the beginning, but a lot of people there at the end, there had to be a lot of immigration one way or another. So two changes in farm technology made this possible, and then really desirable. The first one was the domestication of seed. So I'm going to try to work out the implications of that and show you that without domestic seed, agriculture settlement was not viable in the Jazeera, but with domestic seed, it is. It's not great, as you'll see, but it's feasible. And then the other change in technology is animal-drawn plows, and these come later. And this turns feasibility into real desirability. There's some big productivity impacts from that have, I think, far-reaching ramifications. Right. So understanding the impact of these technical changes requires a new concept. Well, a new for these lectures, but not a new to people, and that's the agricultural surplus. So the return rate, which we've been using before, is not adequate. And it's not adequate because it doesn't deal with seasonality in agriculture. The return rate's pretty good for analyzing what happens when people go out, find something, pick it up, and eat it. It's all very closely connected. So the amount of calories you get relating to the time it took pretty much sums up the productivity issues. But with cultivation, you're planting seeds at early in the season, and they mature, and the land has to be worked at the outset, and the seed stuff has to be harvested, maybe processed. So there's a long time period here, and the demands requirements for labor fluctuate considerably from task to task. And it's really important to pay attention to that. So the two peak demands, at least at the beginning, are harvesting and tillage. Now, when agricultural historians in the modern world talk about this kind of issue, they just talk about harvesting. That's always the big peak labor demand. But at the outset, tillage took a lot of labor. Before plows, you're using stone hoes, for instance. So this, if you can imagine, tilling the land, turning the land in your back garden with a stone hoe rather than a steel shovel, you begin to get some idea that this may be very time intensive. But the agricultural surplus reflects and incorporates these things. So I define the agricultural surplus to be the farm output on the largest farm a family could cultivate with its own labor, minus the subsistence requirement of the family. So we imagine we have a family, they're cultivating land. What's the most amount of land they could cultivate with their labor? How much would that produce? And the difference between what that would produce and what it takes them to survive for the year, that's going to be the agricultural surplus. And the agricultural surplus is going to illuminate many issues like the viability of farming, the division of labor, inequality, and a lot of other things. So one of these that's really important in explaining the settlement process is farm viability. So my mental view of this is I see the agricultural enterprise, as it were, as a family farm with a man, a woman, and 3 children. And how, they're doing the cultivation of crops. There's also an animal component to this. Really early on, this may be hunting wild stuff like gazelle, but later is taking care of domestic animals. And I do see this as, especially the domestic animals, is probably involving common pasture in the vicinity of the village, not privately delineated pasture, but probably in my mind, my ethnographic parallel is a medieval village with a common and a village herd. So a farm was viable if it generated enough food to support the family cultivating it. So one test for viability is in terms of the agricultural surplus. So was a farm viable? The answer is yes, if and only if the agricultural surplus was greater than or equal to 0. So if the agricultural surplus is less than 0, that meant that the biggest farm that a family could operate would not have been large enough to support the family, right? Their subsistence requirements would have been more than what produced. So the farm's not viable. Like nobody's going to go and live there and do that, right? But conversely, if the agricultural surplus is greater than zero, then the biggest farm they can operate would produce more food than they need to survive. And so at least you can imagine somebody doing it. They're not going to die out doing that. This is different from the return rate. The return rate compares total production with total hours worked over the whole year. And the analysis based on the agricultural surplus gives different answers than the return rate due to the seasonality of farm work. As I said, there's two peaks, one's harvest and one's tillage. And the important point about farm sizes and viability is that the most stringent peak labor demand limits the farm size, even if it doesn't absorb a lot of hours. So if like the harvest is the most labor intensive time, the amount of land that you can harvest limits the size of your farm. And even if it doesn't involve, it might be a short time period, so it might not involve a lot of total number of hours, but it really is key. So this is what we were trying to get at. And an improvement that eases a constraint like that may cause a big increase in farm size and surplus, but have little effect on the return rate. And I'll give you examples of that. That's exactly what happens. So how do I calculate this? So we basically use the kind of a farm model that I developed in the last two lectures. And to apply this to the surplus idea, we have to figure out what the maximum sizes would be for tilling the land, how many hectares a family could till and how many it could harvest, and see what those implications are. So the maximum number of hectares that the family could till equals 70 days, which is the time I think they have available, times 10 hours a day, which is what I'm letting them work. And you divide that by 700 hours by how many hours it takes to till a hectare. And so clearly, the more hours it takes to till a hectare, the smaller the land they can till. And the same thing with harvesting, but the harvest period I make shorter. These times come from looking at agricultural calendars. And obviously this isn't precise, but this is how I'm setting it up. So harvesting, I give them 40 days, and so 400 hours, and that's for one person. If there's two people, it's going to be 800 hours. They could, and dividing that by how the time it takes to harvest a hectare will determine the maximum hectares they can do. And the smaller of these is going to set the size of the farm the maximum size farm that they can manage. So obviously enough, as harvesting and tillage get more efficient, like as you can do more hours, you can do more land in an hour, you can have a bigger size farm. Now, just a few things here. So like both of these things, these productivities in these two tasks change over this period. So there is some data that I found on how much you can harvest with stone sickles of different kinds of designs, and they get better, all right, over this period, I think. And so that means that you can, a farmer could harvest more. And you go from like a stone hose at the beginning for tillage to like plows and hawk-drawn plows, and that you can till a lot more land in a day with a plow than you can with a stone hoe. So this has a big impact. Another thing that's important about this is that when you think of it just works out by chance that with the primitive harvesting and tillage technology, with a stone hoe and most primitive sickle, the implication for both of them points to a farm of about 2 1/3 hectares. It didn't have to come out to the same thing, but it does. And when these things get relaxed, you can get a big jump upward in farm size. It goes from about 2 1/3 to about 4 hectares. That's the sort of range that we're talking about. This is land that could till. And that's kind of, I find those numbers plausible because they're like peasant farms in the Middle Ages, and they're using that kind of technology too. So it seems to me makes sense. Okay, so agriculture, what are some of the implications of this? So I already talked about agricultural surplus and farm viability. Agricultural surplus has a big impact on the structure of the economy. So the great physiocratic insight was that the division of labor is limited by the productivity of agriculture. This is Kinnaid didn't say that, but Adam Smith, of course, said the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, which is an ideal we'll come to next time. But the physiocrats basically said it's the productivity of agriculture. And the bigger the agricultural surplus, the larger is the population share that can live off the farm, which is to say you get a society-wide division of labor. So if food consumption is the same for everybody, then in fact, the non-agricultural share of the population equals the agricultural surplus divided by total output. So if you've got, if you're producing just a little bit more than it takes to support the farm population, suppose like, then almost all the people are going to have to be in the farm, and there's just going to be a little bit left over for a non-farm economy, whatever it might be. Whereas if you've got a situation where you say have 3/4 of what you're producing is surplus, so the family only needs 1/4 of what's produced to sustain it, then you can have 3/4 of the population off the farm if everybody's consuming the same amount, of food. So an increase in agricultural surplus can have a big ramifications for how complex the social structure can be. Being off the farm could mean state employees. It could be related to state functions, or it could be related to producing pottery or all sorts of things, or it could be soldiers. Right? The agricultural surplus and inequality, it works pretty much the same way. The bigger the agricultural surplus, the more there is for non-working landlords or the state to take out of agriculture. So actually there's a nice paper by Branko Milanovic and Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson, which proposes the maximum extraction rate, which is the most that the elite could take out of the productive population, keeping it based, pushing their income down to subsistence. And so in this case, the maximum extraction rate is the agricultural surplus relative to farm output. If the state or landlords take that away from the cultivators just have enough to survive. So that's the max they can take. So what did domestication do for us? It raised productivity in all farmings by increasing the effective yield per hectare. So I actually worked backwards from this, if you recall. I had figures for the yield per hectare for like irrigated or naturally irrigated wet cultivation and for rain-fed cultivation. And they worked out at the wet stuff from ER3 was 894 kilograms per hectare of barley. And the rain-fed was 520 kilograms, so considerably lower. And when I was talking about PPNA, the early cultivation with wild seed, I marked all these yields down to try to account for harvesting losses and smaller seed sizes and so forth. So, but when we get domestication, they go back up, right? So that in itself has a big impact on the agricultural surplus and viability and so forth. It doesn't affect the hectares that the family can cultivate. They're determined by the tools and the harvesting and tillage tools. But labor productivity per family rises when output rises from domestication. And it creates large agricultural surpluses on wetland and small surpluses on the Jazeera. So here, just for comparison, I got return rates. So we've got return rates with blue is wild seed and brown is domestic seed. And this is on from foraging. And this is flood recession agriculture and wadi cultivation on wadis. And this is rain fed. And so you can see that the return rates are go down as you go to the right here, and the conditions become more extreme. And similarly, hours worked go up a lot, especially with wild seed. And when you get domestic seed, all of these return rates in the farming systems go higher. The brown bars are higher than the blue bars. Another thing you notice, especially if you're an anarchist, is that foraging gets better return rates than almost anything all the time, right? And if you look over here at hours worked, with anything with wild seed, cultivating that is you're working way much more than you would be if you were a forager. So foraging looks much better. Things are a bit better here with domestic seed, but still well, they're higher, there's more hours, you know. And if we look at the agricultural surplus as the percentage of output with wild seed, it's just about zero, all right, in both flood recession and wadi cultivation. So this is what I think that this movement after the Younger Dryas to plant wild seed, say on these artificial environments where it's not growing naturally, but are very wet, like wadis or along big rivers in a recession context, that's just, it works, but just, right? I mean, these figures show that what they produce is just all taken up, it's all eaten. There's nothing left over. And these are done at 1,800 calories per day, like on average for men, women, and children. So this is like as low as you can do it. This is poor people in poor countries today, really poor people. So, you know, it's not an attractive proposition. I mean, you can get by, but it's not really desirable. And it doesn't work at all on the rain-fed agriculture on the Jazeera. There's a huge negative agricultural surplus. So these farms are not viable with wild seed. That's why there's nobody there on northern Mesopotamia. When you get domestic seed, so like you look at surpluses over here, they become much more substantial on the wet areas, the wadis and the flood recession, the riverbanks, and it gets positive here on the northern Mesopotamia. So you can do it, right? And it breaks even, and the family can support itself, but there's not really a lot left over beyond what the family's going to meet. One thing that's worth thinking about is how about farming with fewer hectares once you get domestic seed. So the last diagram, the diagrams I just showed you assumed that the family farmed the most land that was possible. But actually, they could work less and take the higher productivity off as a leisure, right? And if they did that, actually they could, like on flood recession agriculture with domestic seed, if you just farm enough land to support your family, you can work fewer hours than by foraging. So that would seem like a desirable thing possibly to do. In wadis, it's better than foraging, but not by very much. It's still no good on the rain-fed stuff. So there's a kind of question, I presume if these calculations are correct, that people at the time had figured this out. So why work more than the minimum? And it seems to me, why farm more hectares than the minimum? It seems to me there's three reasons. One is you might want to eat more than the 1,800 calories per day. So, because that's a very stringent diet, right? So if you wanted more food, that would be a reason. The other thing is that there's manufacturing started. So if you want more obsidian tools, for instance, that's not manufacturing, but if you wanted that, you need to be able to buy them effectively. So you need more food. Or if you want pottery, right? You have to have more stuff because basically you're going to you can produce more barley, but barley is money, and you can buy effectively those things. Or even, I suspect, getting a better house, you know, you need more to do that. So this is like a very reminiscent of early modern Europe with the concept of the industrious revolution, which someone asked about in the last one of the other lectures, right? I mean, here we've got, there's going to be an availability of things you might want to spend money or barley on if you had it. And so that's going to be an incentive to work more and to cultivate more land. Another reason that this might happen is that on wet places, the land, they're limited in size, right? There's not, there's relatively small amounts of wadis and riverbanks. So land was limited in value and could be leased. And the owners of the lessers of land under those circumstances would want to have it in the largest size farms they could, because that maximizes their rent. So that would be another force leading towards larger farms. So I analyzed this all, assuming that we've got full-sized farms, but there probably was a mixture, especially at the beginning. But I think it kind of snowballs that, you know, that the production, as the demand for manufacturers increases, the production increases and so forth, and that leads more people to want it, right? So when agriculture became viable on the Jazeera and other regions where rainfall was more than 200 millimeters a year, what happened? Well, what happened was there was a vast expanse of, quote, free land. This is land that's available. So this land is unowned. It's that's one sense in which it's free. There's no diminishing returns, which is an important economic sense in which it's free. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And so it generates no rent. So that's another sense in which it's free. And this has been a kind of common situation in history, like southern Russia, when in the 17th century, when Moscow's authority over the south is extended across southern Russia. There's a whole lot of land that's added to the empire. It's vacant, and peasants move into that area, and they're not paying. They're set up their own farms and not paying rent, and this precipitates serfdom in Russia to control this, actually. So the USA, the settlement of North America, like has when the Europeans arrive, I mean, compared to the kind of population densities that they are going to generate on the land, there's a lot of free land. And then when the natives die off, as many of them do, there's more free land. And Southeast Asia, when agriculture goes into Southeast Asia at various times, there's a lot of free land there. So this brings us to Domar on the Euphrates. For Domar was an economist at MIT who analyzed the implications of free land for the level of wages and the distribution of the agricultural surplus. So there's your picture of Domar. And this is the first page of his famous Journal of Economic History article on the causes of slavery or serfdom. And he proposes what, he is a theorist, and when he's in this theory mode, he's in various modes in this paper, which confuses things sometimes. But as his theory mode, he says, he proposes a trilemma, as you could say. You can have any two, but only two of the following three conditions. One is free land, the second is free labor, and the third is non-working landlords. You can only have 2 out of 3 of them. If you've got 2 of them, the third one is excluded. So I can show you quickly the graphs here of that to prove that, the 3 cases. Suppose we have free land. So to economists, that means that it's not a scarce resource. There's not diminishing returns. And so we imagine it like this, that you've got, for instance, northern Mesopotamia, and you put a farm family somewhere. So they take up as much land as they want and cultivate it. Then you put another farm family in the region. They do the same thing, but they're apart from each other. They don't adversely affect each other. They're not crowding each other out. So the second farm, we idealize it a little bit, they produce just as much as the first farm. And then you put in a third farm, same thing happens. You can do this for a lot of farms until you fill up the whole region. So that means that the the return rate per farm it's always the same. So the average product of labor, in other words, is always the same. And that's this blue line here. And this is, I don't want to belabor this, but if the average is constant, so there's no diminishing returns, the marginal equals the average, and the marginal curve is the demand curve for labor. So the marginal curve is the extra output you get from an extra family, but that's just the same as the average has been. Right? You just go like that. And so we've got this horizontal demand for labor. We've got this population that's here. So this is output per worker. That's the vertical distance. And that's the population, that's the workers. So the area of that rectangle is total output. Output per worker times numbers of workers. But this is also the wage, the income of the productive workers. And so that's the same thing. So total output is total wages. There's no rent. So there's no non-working landlords. So what if somebody wants to be a landlord? What do you do? Well, if it's southern Russia, what you do is you get the czar to declare all the farmers to be your serfs, and you don't allow them to move, and then you just take stuff from them, and they can't run away anymore because they're not allowed to move, and you've got the army to keep them there or track them down, and so you can suppress wages below total output and create rent. So you can have free land, but unfree labor and non-working landlords. In the third case, where you don't have free land, that's the average product of labor is falling because of diminishing returns. The marginal is below it, and the marginal is the demand for labor. So you get where the population equals that, you get the wage, and that's total wages. Total outputs the average product in the population, so it's bigger, and the difference is rent. So that's Ricardo's view of England in the early 19th century, that you had a landed class that's supported by competitive markets, but it receives rent because of diminishing returns to land. So as far as applying this to the Jazeera goes, there's no government to enforce slavery or serfdom. So we're in a free land case with free labor. And so that means there are going to be no non-working landlords. That's to say that the cultivators are going to get all of the produce of their cultivation of their farms. So if it's the case that we have the subsistence at 1,800 calories, it turns out that the farms that they can cultivate generate for them 2,400 calories. And it's a very nice round number, and it amazed me that it came out to be a round number because it makes it easier to talk about it. But that's what happened. So that's the story. So there's going to be little inequality amongst these people because they're all getting kind of the same thing. So knock-on effect one. The model predicts that population growth and settlement expansion is going to take place until the Jazeera is fully occupied. So we've got here a diagram that's a variant of the last diagram. The left side of the diagram is the Malthusian population model, and the right side is the Domar model of free land and the equilibrium. And so looking at it here on the left side, the subsistence income, where the births equal deaths, that's at 1,800 calories. Oh, and I want to add that in response to all the questions raised in the last lecture, I've been looking at the foods that what the nutrients would be from the foods that would give you 1,800 calories. And there's a lot of protein and a fair amount of fat and a lot of micronutrients. So it's not, we're just talking calories, but there's a lot of other stuff going on here. At any rate, that's the kind of subsistence income, and that's at that income, births equal deaths, and the population is stable. But we're actually, when the cultivators get everything, they're getting 2,400 calories. So here, the birth rate's the same as it was before, but the death rate's lower because people are better fed, so the population's growing. And so we're in this kind of situation where there's a continuous pressure or continuous incentive for population to increase because incomes are high and births are always greater than deaths. And this kind of, we got this long lasting disequilibrium that's going to carry on until all of Mesopotamia is full of people. And then it'll stop because there won't be any more free land. So this is also, it seems to me, like the sort of situation that obtained in North America when maize was crossed the Mississippi River. You had the same kind of situation where these maize villages could keep expanding their populations and settle the whole Mississippi and Ohio Valley region. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. Right. So, and that's what did happen. So this is a little small scale example of what happened. We know from the maps of sites that this had to happen because you get all these sites in Mesopotamia where you didn't have any sites before. But this is, I kind of like this survey of the part of a small region in the northern Jazeera, more or less located here on the map on the left by Wilkinson and Tucker. Here's their map of the actual area, which shows us, and all of these dots with the numbers by them are sites that are in the Hassuna period. So this is after the settlement's happening. And they could find one Neolithic site here. So that's the one circled in red. So before you get the domesticated seed and people moving in, there's this one little teeny place. That's all the settlement there is. And then when the domestication technology becomes available, the whole thing gets settled like that. So this is the kind of process that's going on. So knock-on effect 2, better health. With incomes going up from 1,800 to 2,400 calories and all the protein and micronutrients that go with that extra food, people get healthier. And this shows up in skeleton heights, particularly for men after 5,500 BC. They get taller. Women get a little bit taller, but as you recall, the early agriculture is not as beneficial for women as it is for men, but the men certainly get a lot bigger. Now, effect number 3 is the growth of manufacturing and the division of labor. When the farms generated a surplus that went to the cultivators, they had more food than they needed, and the surplus could be swapped for manufactured goods. So they create a market for manufacturers. Now, we don't really know how these transactions happen, right? So, I mean, I think in some way or another, people grew barley and paid people for things or hired people to do things effectively. Okay. So if we look at our diagram again, this is how it works out, that there was this is the 1,800 calorie subsistence income, and that's the 2,400 calorie income that they're getting as the population keeps growing. And the difference is the surplus that they're getting. That's the production minus their subsistence needs. And some of that's eaten, all right? They just increase their food consumption, but some of it's spent. And what's spent gets, as it were, over here and causes the population to grow more. And you get this non-farm population emerging that are people, they're producing pottery and textiles and so forth. So there is also, eventually there's smelting of copper and bronze. I think there's probably more textile production, but there's not much direct evidence for that one way or another. Pottery is an important example, however, of which there's lots of examples, I think. So the first pots appear across northern Mesopotamia around 6,000 BC, just as the domestication, the spread of domesticated agriculture begins. The pots seem to reflect the experience of making clay figurines. So this sort of figures like this are much older. There are many examples that are much older. So people were making stuff like that, which was made out of clay and being fired and so on. And it seems to transfer into making pots. So the first pots were very crude and fired at low temperatures. This is a picture of one from Yarmo, which is very early and clearly very crude. From 5000 BCE onwards, the shards are widespread and in houses of all sizes. So there seems to be a lot of production going on. So that's the kind of industry, manufacturing that takes place. Technology improves in pottery as it's practiced. So the oldest way of forming them is pots is with coils of clay, I think. And then around 4500 BCE, you get the slow wheel, which is just, you can make a pot on this wheel, which is rotating. And that's pretty good for holding a paintbrush next to it and making circles go around the pots. And then the potter's wheel comes somewhat later. So this is like a kick wheel where the potter kicks this wheel, and this is heavy, so it's got momentum, so it keeps the whole thing going. So we're not up to that yet, but we're starting out going that way. It may be, if you like technological arguments like I do, it may be that the Ubaid pots, which are like this one, which are made on slow wheels, and which are shipped, this is a big common design. You can see that all of these circles around here, not this stuff, not the stuff that looks like a W on its side, but the circles could be made more effectively with a slow wheel, having it spin around and applying the decoration as it passes. So that may have something to do with the popularity of that design as a cheap way of making pots. Kiln designs are also improved. The evolution from open fires to single chamber kilns to double chamber kilns, which are where the fire is separated from the pots. That's a whole technology trajectory there. I've been watching the Great Pottery Throwdown to observe pottery technology. And if anyone saw it 2 weeks ago, I think, when the potters made their own kilns, I think must have been like what a single chamber kiln was like. Anyhow, the bigger is this progression has several implications. One's larger kilns are more fuel efficient, which was an important consideration. And larger kilns, though, make for indivisibility, so it creates scale economies in production, which is likely to lead to concentrated production and shipping and professional potters. So there is a kind of spatial division of labor in potteries that can be observed. So mostly pottery must have been made locally, right? I mean, the only way to get pottery from one place to another is to carry it. So that's very expensive and bound to limit how much can be shipped from any central production facility. But nonetheless, there were some. So there are these examples. Arpachia near Mosul shipped high quality Halaf pottery 25 kilometers to Tepegawar, where pottery was also being made. But there was some, regional trade like that. And some in Chagar Bazaar made fine painted pottery and shipped it 25 kilometers to Tel Akab and other sites. So there's some evidence that was happening. So another knock-on effect 4 is more towns appeared. So the expansion of trade in obsidian and pottery was related to towns appearing at major transport nodes. And the growth of manufacturing could also contribute to the growth of towns, because you have larger scale production because of these kind of kiln economies and so forth, that'll lead to some concentration of production. And the growth of manufacturing and trade led to inventories of goods appearing, and stamp and cylinder seals were used to indicate ownership in the north long before they were found in the south. So here are some pictures of well-known towns. Okay. Knock-on effect 5 is rising inequality. So this is a more complicated, but it's kind of interesting. So how do you get rich on the Jazeera? And so I see this as like you can get rich because you can either get high labor income one way or another, or high capital income or high land income. So how does that work out? So is labor a good source of getting rich? And the answer is probably not. So it's not from working yourself. I mean, most of the cultivators and laborers seem to have gotten, by my arguments analysis, similar incomes that were above subsistence, but they're not rich. And it's likely that skilled work in pottery or metals might have got you more income, but it's still not going to probably really get you rich. If you could have slaves, you could get rich if you had a lot of slaves, but slavery is not really viable because of the absence of institutions to enforce it. So labor is probably not how you're going to get rich. Owning capital seems to give more scope for getting rich. If you could, like kilns or something like that, productive capital, or inventories and trade. If you can, you could probably make a lot of money if you could move a lot of obsidian from Anatolia down to the Jazeera. How you're going to do that's a little tricky, right? And there's no financial institutions, of course. So it's all a question of somehow accumulating family money and reinvesting it and being lucky, probably. And but if you did, you might be able to get rich on something like obsidian or production. And the other is by owning land. So there are some options here, like you can't, if as long as land is free in the Jazeera, you can't own it and make any money off it, because if you tried to get, if you claim that you owned land that someone was farming and demanded rent from them, they could move to some other empty land. So that's a big limitation. But there is, but the kind of wetland, the wadi land and the flood recession land that's generating a substantial surplus, if that was private land, there's, you know, you could rent that land, you could make a lot of money off that. So that's a possibility. So this raises the question about communal land versus private land. So there's unhelpfully, there's no direct evidence at all about land tenure. So we can speculate. We can only speculate. There are some efficiency arguments for privatizing land, which more or less come down to saying that the private property is necessary for the cultivator to reap literally the return from what he sows. But communal tenure doesn't preclude that. You know, many groups guarantee sort of secure occupation while not allowing for the sale or lease of the land. And if you can't sell or lease the lands, you can't, it's not a basis for a big fortune. So like I think about villages like repetitional communes in late imperial Russia, where the village community owned the land and all of the members of the community who were in the village and wanted to farm got land, and land was periodically, like often every decade, redistributed. So people who wanted land got it. But by the same token, if you had a farm and you decided to go work in a textile mill in Moscow and left your farm, you lost it the next time there was a redistribution. You couldn't lease it out to somebody or sell it to somebody. And the same kind of tenure, Musa tenure, was quite common in the Middle East up until, you know, imperial privatization and land redistribution programs came into effect. So, you know, it's, and in the last lecture, we saw that in the Americas that maize seed was domesticated by mobile foragers who planted seeds and then returned to harvest them. So that's not exactly a big substantial property interest in the land, just to be able to do that. So another feature that, but a feature that militated against privatizing land or buying and selling land was the sharing ethic, which I think is common, was common in the foraging and PPNA economies. And it's rooted in the economic circumstances of those economies. So the feature that's important about this is that with foragers, the harvests of grain and acorns are highly variable. And so you could easily have years where there wasn't very much around. And so it makes sense to share what there is amongst those who have it. So, and the same thing with the PPNA cultivators of wild cereals, they're probably also on the edge, right? Their average incomes or just break even, right? So there's going to be bound to be years where things are bad. And as long as it's not uniformly bad, so some people aren't so bad off, but other people are worse off, and that fluctuates back and forth. It makes sense for these people to share stuff amongst themselves to insure against their losses. And so I can see under those circumstances or low productivity and high variability, that a sharing ethic makes a lot of sense. So I'm not surprised that would be the case. So it is interesting that circumstances in these terms change by the end of the PPNB when you've got domestic seed. Because with domestic seed, most of the cultivators are mostly in surplus most of the time, right? The rise in productivity means that people are not on average just getting by. On average, they're doing better than just getting by. So the years in which things are bad, it's a much lower probability. And so there's less need for insurance because of higher productivity. And so I can see that there's going to be an erosion of the sharing ethic as the society develops in those terms. And we also begin to see indicators of private property, like seals appear that are markers of private ownership here. So, and just that's not land, right? That's like commodities. But there seems to be some movement towards private ownership of commodities. And so as the sharing ethic declines, I can see the privatization of land became easier. Now, this is a completely imaginary story, right? I can imagine this beginning with renting. The proverbial widow lacks labor to cultivate her farm, so she lets it to a neighbor with many sons in exchange for part of the harvest. And so when such transactions become routine, land might even be bought and sold. So I can imagine this trajectory because of the decline, because productivity is higher, as sharing ethic declines, and it renting solves immediate practical problems, which leads to a general movement towards privatization of land. And there may be an ideological echo of this, that the abandonment indeed of communal ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe, the shift of rituals to domestic settings may reflect privatization of storage and less reliance on group activities. But all this is just speculation. So inequality increases. So this could have come from profits on capital or rent on privatized wetland or conceivably skilled earnings. These are Gini coefficients. So Gini coefficients for wealth inequality. So Gini coefficients is an index that economists have made up to measure inequality, and it ranges from 0 to 1. So a value of 0 means that everybody's the same. And a value of 1 means that one person has everything and everybody else has nothing. So those are the polar cases, right? And so a bigger number means more inequality. And so these two, so there is a project with Bogart, Bowles, Fochesato, and some other co-authors sometimes who, I know Mattia Fochesato worked out this procedure for working out Gini coefficients from grave goods and from house sizes and merging them indeed, which is what's being applied to data from different archaeological sites by these researchers. And the blue dots, each blue dot is a different site at a different time. And so we've got some two early sites here, like this is like Natufian and earlier Awalo 2 cave. So these are very low inequality, right? These are very equal, the most equal societies. This is not a big data set, I admit, but it's what I have. And then you get up here and we've got two sites here, Çatalhöyük and Sabi Abyad, which are PPNB sites. They've got cultivated grains here, and they're getting into at the beginning of this period we're talking about. And they're also wet areas like wadis and that sort of thing. So you can imagine that there's land that has value there, and they've got higher inequality. We're going to get to these other sites later. Just a trailer like Tepigawa, which so these sites have plows, and many of them have irrigation. And Tepigawa, which I mentioned is a destination of Halef pottery, is one of the sites up here. And there's another northern site, and then these are some southern sites. And this is going to show you what happens when you get real options for inequality. But there's an upward movement here that's taken place even before you get there. So knock-on effect 6 is raids and warfare. Wealthy towns made targets. They could be sacked and plundered in raids. So these are examples. I just tried to find a list and make a list of places where there was examples of warfare and sacking early on. And I got those. I'll show you them on a map in a minute, which is more revealing. Here are some 4th millennium wars. Habbakuk, which has gazillions of sling projectiles from a big battle, and Tel Brak, which was the largest city in the north. And this has got a large number of violent deaths and casual disposals. And my introducer herself argues that this is a link to considerable inequality. It's a civil war, right? It's not so domestic discord, which might not be. It doesn't surprise me if there's a big increase in inequality going on. And here's what happens if you put them on a map. So they are all like that. And this is like going from the Cappadocian obsidian mines across on the main obsidian route that goes across the north. So maybe it has to do with, maybe these places are all involved in wars or targets of raids because they're rich, because people made a lot of money off obsidian. Knock-on effect 7 is labor-saving technical change. And this is the last knock-on effect. So this brings us to our other economic historian, H.J. Habbakuk, who's famous for all sorts of things, but in his book, American and British Technology in the 19th Century, he worked out the technological implications of free land, by which he meant the American West, for technology development. And his argument was basic. He wanted to explain why you had a high level of machine technology and mechanization in the United States happening in the 19th century, and why this American mode of production was surpassing the mechanization of Britain. And the argument was there was free land that led to high wages, which is the kind of argument I was making here about what's happening with domestic crops in the Jazeera, which leads to the search for labor-saving technology. So I wondered, are there parallels in the Middle East? And the answer has to be yes, or I wouldn't be talking about it. So, we have a lot of capital-intensive technology developed in this period. So use of animals, that's capital. Donkeys come in as pack animals. They come out of Africa as early as about 4000 BCE. The horse comes out later, so that's not really part of our story at this point. But oxen, cattle enter northern Mesopotamia perhaps as early as 8000 BCE, and they can pull things. And we don't really know when the ox-drawn plow was first used, but this is something that's happening, certainly by the end of this period, that's being used. So all these things represent an increase in the capital labor ratio. And so their development would have been encouraged by a high wage economy, because it makes sense to try to save labor if it's expensive. And perhaps raising oxen and using them to pull things is a good, sensible thing to do. So I think that the development of oxen traction comes from probably the first use of oxen was dragging things. Presumably timber for construction on the Jazeera was dragged from the adjoining mountains. Certainly, if I had to move a heavy log out of the forest, which I have done, having a big animal pull it seems like a kind of no-brainer. You know, you could do this with female oxen in an early date. Males are, on the one hand, the advantage is they're bigger and stronger. On the other hand, they're really dangerous. So castration had to be developed as a technology to deal with that. Then they could drag sleds and so forth. I wonder whether this was the inspiration for the plow. As I say, you know, dragging logs from the forest with an animal seems like a good idea. And if your log was like this, so to get the log out, you have to chop the branches off, right? But then there's all these stumps. So just imagine what would happen if you drag this log across your garden, right? It would tear up things pretty badly, right? And so, I mean, the plow is just a kind of specific version of doing that. So I wonder if that wasn't the inspiration for plows. There are issues here about plows, right? You don't have iron for plow shares. There are experiments that show that oak plows would work. And this is a picture of a stone plow share. I don't quite know how that worked, but that's from the British Museum, but maybe you can do that. That's a picture of an ox-drawn plow from Europe at like roughly 4000 BCE. But it's quite likely that this happens earlier. So what did oxen and plows then do for us? Well, there's a small increase. So I computed out return rates and hours worked and the agricultural surplus to try to figure this out. So there's a small increase in return rates on wadis and rain-fed parts of the Jazeera. So those are down here. And if you compare, that's the rain-fed and that's the wadi, and the yellow is with the plow and the brown is with just a hoe. And so the yellow bars are a little bit higher. So you get some return rate effect here. There's nothing happening on the flood recession agriculture because you don't till that. So there's no savings there. And there's a little change. You work a few hours less with, that doesn't look right. We'll skip that. The big impact is on the agricultural surplus though. So here you get you know, a more substantial increase in agricultural surplus on wadi cultivation and a really big increase in agricultural surplus on the rain-fed agriculture. So this is an example of how, so what's happening here is that you, in the rain-fed, you're releasing this tillage constraint. And so the farms can jump in size from 2 1/3 to 4 hectares. There's no increase, so that increases production. There's no increase in this family labor subsistence requirement because it's just a family still. So the surplus goes up. The amount of hours involved is actually not that very great, but it's kind of concentrated, right? Which creates the constraint. So it doesn't show up in the return rate, but it shows up in the surplus, right? And so that has a big impact, right? So once the plow comes in, especially in northern Mesopotamia, the chances for increased inequality, for more demand for manufacturers, all this stuff, you know, has a big effect there, right? So it's a greater impetus for extension of manufacturing, division of labor, more towns, inequality. You also get a big potential tax base for a state for that to, you know, come into being. So I think, you know, you didn't have states before this because there's no tax base for the states. States need a tax base, but now we created a tax base, so you expect to see states. So eventually the Jazeera fills up with people and there's no more free land and there's free labor and non-working landlords. So I don't know when this happened, a big thing. I don't exactly know when it happened, but that carries everything further because then you have instead of land being free, it's scarce, so rent's generated everywhere, so you can get even more inequality or more manufacturing or whatever. So from this period, 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, technology and the economy co-evolved. Domestication of seed led to settlement expansion, the settling of the Jazeera, income growth, higher incomes and broader markets led to technological innovation. We've got plows, pottery wheels, oxen too. Some features of the expansion were more desirable, like high consumption, and others less so, like war. But progress became irreversible, right? Greater population meant that people could not go back to foraging, even though it meant fewer hours of work and a higher return rate, right? So that the big increase is a big increase in population, and it's all in this agricultural sector. And even though the forager sector is out there and people might like it, it's just never going to be big enough to support anybody. So that's social evolution. Society has moved to agriculture and it can't go back. Thank you.
So, are there any questions? John?
Yeah.
You have to yell to the internet.
That's right. The internet. Yeah, these are really interesting questions, and whenever I see someone working on it, I think about how we dealt with this, or thought about these from a Mesopotamianist's perspective. And there is a question at the end of what I'm about to say, but have you heard of the project Modeling Ancient Settlement Systems?
I might have.
It's a big project that was funded by the National Science Foundation, and it was the major team were individuals like Tony Wilkinson, who you mentioned, and other colleagues at the University of Chicago, together with Argonne National Labs. And we did a multi-year, very extensive modeling of settlements and farming in the Jazeera region, post-settlement. And we came up with a lot of different data, published multiple books, and you'll probably find a lot of really great stuff in there that will add a lot more data, and some of the problems you're working on have been worked through quite a bit there.
Right.
But one of the things that consistently caused problems for the model and caused settlements to fail were labor issues, lack of labor and people. And this is, and when I say we found, I just mean my participation was only as a graduate student who was just plugging in input data into it. So we is really perhaps not appropriate for use. But anyways, that problem came up consistently in the model. And at the same time I was doing that, I started to work on historical demography of Mesopotamia, both using textual records and also various things like model life tables, and putting those together with a lot of people from the classical world who were working on that too. And what we found, and all the evidence points to this, is that in general, population growth in Mesopotamia, especially after settlement, was extremely low through natural means, meaning without migration. And in fact, the majority of families had about 1.8 to maybe 2.1 kids, which means they were barely replacing their population at all. And that at times of extreme stress, that the population would drop. It would take centuries without migration for these places to return to their population, their original population. So it's much, much smaller. And then my third point is this did lead me to write it led me to top right and discover Domar and Niebuhr and the hypothesis that you just mentioned. And I wrote a really long and bestial article on it, on Mesopotamian populations, in the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient. Plug for myself, which you will find a lot of discussion on that theory, but with using a lot of qualitative data from Mesopotamia, where they really discuss quite a bit about lack of labor and issues of this sort. But then, so my question is finally, what would happen if your families in your model didn't have 3 children in them for labor purposes, but instead had 2?
Nothing much would happen in my model. So it's very interesting what you're saying. And so the sort of labor scarcity issues that arise, that's what I'm talking about, right? I mean, that is the same, free land as the flip side of free land is labor scarcity issues. So I'm glad to hear that part. Children don't play much of a role. So children play a role in eating, right? So if I had 2 children instead of 3 children, the family subsistence requirement would be a little bit smaller. And I'm not sure that drives much. But then the children in my model don't really work. Like I keep track of adult time, but not children's time. So like, and the reason, I mean, I did think about this. And so for instance, I found one paper on flood recession agriculture in Senegal. And it turned out that 78% of the labor time in flood recession agriculture was children. So what were the children doing? The children were by the river scaring birds away when they were there. So I can see that children doing stuff like that, but I didn't keep track of it in terms of harvesting and tilling, because they're not doing that kind of stuff, which seemed to me the bottleneck stuff in the production process.
But I guess my point would be population growth plays a significant role in your
So if it's
evolution as a major driver of it. And if that isn't there, perhaps the situation might be a lot more complicated.
So I think what I mean, I have to look at the facts in more detail, but I mean, it means the population growth rate is lower than it would be otherwise. And it might be very low, right? Yeah, the natural rate of increase, right? It could also, so another thing which I did is I assumed that we had this kind of positive check model. So the birth rate was always at this fixed high level. The other Malthusian version is a preventive check model, whereas people's fertility rate drops as their standard of living falls. And I think the basic structure, if I did all this with that model, the basic structure would be the same and the basic qualitative conclusions would be the same, but it would allow this, it would be more complicated to lay out and explain, which is one reason I didn't do it. But it would allow for the birth rate to be falling off towards levels like you're talking about.
Thanks. It is a sort of related question, which is that I mostly know Niebuhr, Domar, with regard to the emergence of slavery or the argument about the emergence of slavery. And it strikes me that, if you need labor, there's a dramatic labor shortage. And there are these evidences of war and trade and things happening, that slavery could be an answer to what is happening in terms of searching for labor inputs. But also I was mostly wondering about how slavery might figure into the sort of expansion of capital in this period, and also correspondingly inequality, I suppose, because if oxen and donkeys are functioning as capital, then also laborers who are owned by people could also function as capital, but also could be used to transport goods along trade routes and that kind of thing. So I was just wondering, I felt like slavery was sort of mentioned as a potential labor thing, but not actually sort of more fully integrated into all of the developments that were happening. And since the Habbakuk, I mean, is sort of trying to identify high wages as causing technological growth in the US. Obviously, like slavery is a big issue in the 19th century US as well. And slavery is another way of answering the high wages problem there.
Yeah, so it works in the US South because you have the Fugitive Slave Act, right? And so if slaves run off, they get captured and returned and to the owners. So you need some kind of functional equivalent of that for slavery to have worked in northern Mesopotamia. I think that's another aspect of this. So I like, for instance, well, that's I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Another extremely interesting lecture. Arising from the last two questions, I have a couple of thoughts. And one is on slavery. I'm not sure the US South is the best comparator because they have a relatively strong coercive capacity.
Yeah.
In 19th, 19th century West Africa, where you have some strong states who seem to have treated their slaves more harshly, you also had even so-called stateless societies in which slavery did exist, but the slaves were somewhat better treated, as in allowing them extra time to work for themselves during the week. So in other words, you don't have to choose, I think, between pure coercion and pure free labor. You can also have a situation where there certainly is coercion, but it's tempered with some incentives to persuade the slaves, particularly if they female have children, that it's not really worth running away. My other thought is, listen to your conversation with Jonathan, maybe Shayanov, or rather the neoclassical version of the Shayanov model is relevant. In other words, family life cycles, so that while at some certain point children are only good for scaring birds, when you have teenage children, they did permit a large area to be cultivated, but the appearance of inequality is only cyclical. And that would sort of fit into an idea of it taking it a very long time for inequality to develop.
I think that's a good idea. And I think, yeah, so certainly some of the Russian reputational communes, when they redivided land, they took account of it wasn't the same amount per family, same amount per a working male, I think, for instance. So if they had big children to do work, they got more land to do it with in those divisions, but then they lost it, right? As you say, as the family aged, they go off and now you have their own households. It's all redone. Mm-hmm. And that's a good point as well about yes, there certainly are slave systems where slaves have positive incentives to do work. Yeah.
Thanks. So it seemed like the initial wave of settlement happened in hillier areas, and as seeds developed, moved into Mesopotamia. Was the situation in Egypt similar?
So Egypt is interesting because it's a forager hangout for a long time, right? I mean, they don't take. I don't think that agriculture gets underway in Egypt till like the 4th millennium. So like thousands of years after this stuff, right? I mean, but the Nile Delta must have been a great place to be a forager, right? I mean, it's all wet and there's all kinds of bird life and then animals and stuff like that, and even along the the upper Nile, it's floods up in the summer, and then the water goes down, and yeah, so foragers are there for a long time.
So the reason why the Tigris and Euphrates were developed for agriculture and the Nile wasn't, was that foraging was so much better in the Nile.
Yeah, I think. Well, I see Egypt also in Domar kind of terms, to be honest. So agriculture does start, I think, in the 4th millennium, and then. But it's a kind of situation where it's not highly populated, and so it's impossible. There are these sort of local governments, nomes, that could tax, but they can't tax very much because people keep moving away, right? Or they won't, if they're cultivating at all, they can go off and forage, or they can move someplace else. And so it's only when the entire Nile Valley's got one central government, which is when the Egyptian state is constituted, that they can't run away. And by then they can't leave the Nile Valley because it's real desert out there. And so they're trapped. And once they're trapped, then actually agriculture, I think, is extended further by the imposition of taxation and grain on all these people. So the foragers have to settle down and farm in order to pay their taxes. So this is different from my view of southern Mesopotamia, which I'll tell you next time, which is not so coercive, or at least not in the same way.
Yeah, thank you again for this. And I guess one of the things I would be interested in is how applicable your models and predictions are in other parts of the world. This is obviously just one trajectory for the spread of agriculture. It's very interesting. But like one thing that jumps out at me in particular is like, how dependent are your predictions on the labor inputs necessary for harvest and tillage? What if you have, say, 80 days for harvest, or like a vast difference, but a vast divergence from those 40 to 70 days, such as you would get in like a multi-cropping system, where agriculture emerged in South Asia?
That's really good questions. I'd have to figure this out. I haven't tried this. The only thing I would say is I think this argument about the introduction of a mature agricultural system into an area that doesn't have one, leading to population growth and the spread of the system, may have other applications. Like I think this is what happened with maize in the Mississippi Valley. I think that's a similar story. And the other thing I wonder about, which is relevant to this, is if you have a culture like, this may be too oversimplified, but if like in China, where you have rice cultivation and where they have pottery so they can boil their rice, so the women don't spend all day grinding grain because they're going to boil it instead. Does this lead to some kind of, does this have implications, right? I mean, beyond the situation, like, I mean, the classical phrase for Yangtze agriculture is man plows, woman weaves, right? And the women are doing all this textile work and spinning and weaving cloth, some of it with the cotton that the man has produced, but as well as food. And so you've got this household division of labor that's different. Did that happen early? Did that have implications for, the sort of overall development of the society? I mean, is this a way in which the culinary traditions actually have profound implications for how things work? I don't know, but it's a thought.
Other questions?
Yeah, this is completely.
You've got to speak to the internet.
Just a complete observation from ignorance. Your early maps seem to show a lot of concentration of activity, dots, I presume excavations.
Yes.
In the Holy Land area.
Yes.
But we're not hearing, I think, we're not hearing much about that part of the area. Is that
I did talk a little bit about that, actually. Yeah, I was meaning to talk about that. Not today. Didn't hear anything about that today.
Yeah.
But these arguments about for a landscape in which you had on the hillsides woodland, like oak forests interspersed with clearings with wheat and barley, and then the plains with gazelle and stuff. That was all thought out for the Levant, right, the southern Levant, and it has mutatis mutandis. It has some applicability elsewhere, but it's, you know, if we did this in 1995, right, that's where the whole story would be, and that's what pretty much a lot of the story would be there, and I'd be talking about those sites that you see on the map.
Yeah.
A lot of the other stuff wasn't known so much.
Well, I'm asking these questions from basic no knowledge. Is it the case that this part of the world at this time is relatively stable, its climate? Because I'm thinking, you know, Western Europe, which is a long time in the future here, is a place where you get a lot of climatic variability, and so agricultural policies have to adjust to that in all kinds of ways. But does this happen to be part of the world where the climate is a little bit more predictable and you're less likely to get nasty droughts and things like that, or is that just
You get these big shocks, like the Younger Dryas shock, right?
yeah, that's more like I'm thinking more
From year to year.
year to year rather. Yeah, I mean you started with the ice age as being the big driver,
Yeah.
so I get that, but I'm thinking about the variability from year to year. Yeah.
There's certainly variability from year to year. I haven't tried to. I'm sure there's a lot of information about it too, but I haven't got into it. I guess I see it impinging on the story though, as this question of like, where should I set subsistence, like with respect, if there, there's bad years and there's good years, and how should this be integrated into things? And maybe I'm going too easily over a difficult problem.
Yeah, I think hopefully I would like to see that.
This is just a first in your calculation of surplus, agricultural surplus with plants.
Yes.
You take into account also the problem which has been raised. I think the oxens do they eat anything?
Yes, they eat.
Is that part of the calculation?
I used, so this is tricky, and I allowed them the earth-free grain ration. Now that's a bit problematic, right? Because when in southern Mesopotamia, there's not a lot of pasture, so you got to feed the oxen grain. In the north, there's steppe, right? So they may not actually be being fed the grain. It doesn't work out to be that much stuff that I thought I should. I didn't do anything about it, but it sits in the back of my mind that I should actually make the program more elaborate and not have them eating grain in the north. But I did think about that, yes, and they're getting fed.
Okay, other questions? All right, well, thank you again.
Thank you.